I specifically work for the Storm Surge Unit, which is a division of the National Hurricane Center. So the National Hurricane Center is composed of a couple different entities. So the Storm Surge Unit is one of them, which is where I'm employed. There is the Hurricane Specialist Unit, which are in charge of issuing the official forecasts for hurricanes within the Atlantic Basin. There's also a Marine Unit, which is called TAF-B, that provides forecast for large vessels and carriers across the Atlantic Ocean within a very specific domain. And then there's also the Forecast Office. So just like you have one in Boulder, there's also one stationed at the Hurricane Center. Yeah, storm surge is the abnormal rise of water above ground. And the reason it's important, it's associated with landfalling tropical cyclones or extratropical cyclones. But the reason it's important is because historically it's accounted for about 50% of fatalities during a landfalling cyclone. So about 9 years ago now, the Storm Surge Unit was created, which is currently led by Jamie Rome, with the specific tasking of focusing on the storm surge problem, identifying why people were dying in storm surge, and generating ideas and solutions to specifically attack that. And over the last, I'd say, 6 to 7 years, we've really come a long way with regard to how we forecast, communicate, and describe storm surge to the public. And I think you can really start to see that in some of the fatality numbers over the past 3 or 4 years with some of the major landfalls that we've had. The Hurricane Specialist Unit track all tropical systems via satellite, remote sensing, a number of different ways. So unless there's a storm developing very near the coast, it's usually not a surprise. So there's some spin up time. Most cases, sometimes it's very quick. But generally the timeline goes as follows. So if there's a storm that we've been watching or tracking for a few days, or it's a newly developed storm, and the forecast calls for it to approach the coast or make landfall in the official forecast beyond 5 days, that's when we start just generally monitoring the system. We'll probably do some readiness testing, coordination with all of the line offices, the local WFOs, make sure that our systems are working. As you move towards that 4 to 5 day timescale, that's when the involvement with the emergency managers really begins, and some of those prepping procedures go into action. Depending on the scale of the storm or the forecast, we might begin to start helping in, I guess, guide evacuation decisions with emergency managers. And really the 4 day, 96-hour time period is when operations for us really start to ramp up. So we'll go into 24/7 shift work. So we'll have a shift during the day, the evening, the overnight, and the early morning. So the entire 24-hour period is covered. And once you encroach on that 48 to 54-hour time period, that's when we begin to consider things like storm surge watches. And that's when we begin to run some of our modeling for storm surge. So once we get to that 48 hours is really a critical time period for us. So some of the guidance that we'll use, the guidance that we use is called P-Surge. We don't have to get into the specifics of that, but it's essentially just a probabilistic data set that's used to inform things like watches and warnings. So if we exceed certain thresholds in certain locations, then we'll consider putting a storm surge watch within those locations. And moving in towards the 36-hour time period is when our storm surge warnings are considered. So if confidence increases and we reach that 36-hour time period, then that's when we consider upgrading portions of the watch to a warning. That's also when we begin to issue things like the inundation graphic, which is another official product. So the two main products that we issue right now that come directly from SSU are the storm surge watch warning, and the inundation graphic. And so the inundation graphic is used as a visual display of how high the water could come up possibly at any location. It's not going to reach our values everywhere because we use probabilistic and it's the 10% exceedance, but it gives you a footprint of where it's essentially a risk map. It gives you a footprint of locations that need to be aware of a potential water rise from storm surge. So that 36 to 48 hour period prior to landfall, I would say is probably our busiest time, because once we have those watches and warnings up, we do our best not to change them just to maintain consistency through the advisory cycle. And then from there, it's kind of just monitoring the situation, make sure there's no large deviations in the track. We're continually reviewing model guidance to make sure our forecast is on track. And we have a number of people in our unit. I'm one of several UCAR employees here, and we each have kind of different responsibilities within the storm. So we'll have people designated to do specific tasks within the storm. So, and then once the 0 hour comes, landfall comes, we kind of transition from a forecasting position to a hindcasting position. And what that means is that over the past few years, one of the efforts that we've really tried to push forward is helping to allocate assets where they're needed, the hardest hit areas. So we will run what's called a hindcast using the same model. We'll try to use observations and generate a footprint of where the highest storm surge was. And we'll try to accelerate those disaster declarations, which has been a huge help for FEMA over the past few years. It's really humbling work. I think that once I remember my first storm, and you know, I had come from a weather forecast office prior to working here, but then once you actually work through a storm and realize the decision chain, the magnitude of the decisions that are made, even with weaker storms like Cristobal, it's really complex and it's also really fulfilling. So it's one of those jobs that I think I'm very happy to have the opportunity to work here, and hopefully we're providing a service for the good of the country.